The fastest way to destroy a company is to fire the woman who remembers how everything actually works. I realized that at exactly 9:15 on a rainy Monday morning, while standing outside a locked training room holding a cardboard box full of binders nobody inside the building knew how to use without me. 13 years at that logistics company ended with a human resources director smiling politely across a conference table while calling my position non-essential operational overhead. Funny thing about corporate language is how often people use calm voices while making catastrophic decisions. The company sat just outside downtown Nashville near the interstate where freight trucks rolled through distribution lanes day and night carrying retail inventory across half the southeast. From the outside, the place looked efficient. Bright white warehouse lights, perfectly organized loading docks, digital dispatch screens glowing green beside shipping schedules. But underneath all that polished structure lived hundreds of tiny process connections most executives never noticed because somebody like me quietly kept them moving every day before problems reached leadership. My official title was Senior Training and Process Manager, which sounded simple enough for people who never understood what I actually did. Human Resources thought I handled onboarding videos and compliance seminars. In reality, I managed the approval chains connecting warehouse access, dispatch sequencing, payroll activation, safety certification, compliance verification, and employee clearance systems together across 5 departments. I was not the software. I was the person translating the software into movement. Without that translation, systems stopped talking to each other correctly. But executives love believing dashboards run companies instead of people. Especially human resources departments obsessed with reducing payroll before quarterly reviews. Training can be streamlined, the HR director told me while sliding termination paperwork across the conference table beneath fluorescent office lights. Outside the glass walls behind her, I could see 47 new seasonal hires already, gathering near the training room waiting for orientation packets and warehouse clearance badges. Peak shipping season started in less than 48 hours. We are restructuring operational redundancies, she continued carefully. Redundancies. Another corporate word executives use when they do not understand dependency chains. I sat quietly for a moment listening to rain tapping softly against the building windows, while forklifts hummed somewhere far beyond the warehouse walls outside. Then I looked directly at her and asked the only question that actually mattered. Did anyone transfer the approval node permissions before disabling my account? Blank silence answered first. Not confusion exactly. Worse. Assumption. The HR director glanced toward the regional operations supervisor sitting beside her, and he immediately looked down at the termination folder instead of meeting my eyes. That was when I understood nobody upstairs even realized the systems were connected through my workflow authorizations. The process manuals are already documented. Human Resources replied finally with the kind of confidence people use when they think paperwork and understanding are the same thing. I almost smiled hearing that because manuals only explain procedures under normal conditions. Operations collapse inside exceptions, bottlenecks, timing conflicts, and human sequencing decisions nobody bothers documenting fully because experienced employees solve them instinctively in real time. You should not disable my permissions before transferring dispatch clearance authority, I said calmly. The warehouse release chain depends on those approvals. The regional supervisor finally spoke for the first time. Information technology already handled the transition. Information technology. Of course. Somebody probably checked boxes in a permissions dashboard Friday afternoon without understanding what the permissions actually controlled. I signed nothing. Instead, I stood slowly, collected my coffee mug and 2 process binders from the conference table, then walked toward the hallway outside where dozens of new hires waited near the training room laughing nervously while checking phones and carrying onboarding packets. Some smiled at me automatically because I trained half the building over the past decade. At exactly 9:15, I pressed my employee badge against the training room scanner one last time. Red light. Access denied. Behind me, 47 employees stopped talking at the exact same moment. And somewhere deep inside the warehouse, the first dispatch queue quietly turned yellow. The company announced my replacement less than 20 minutes after my badge stopped working. That part would have been funny if the timing had not been so dangerous. Human Resources moved quickly because executives always believe confidence can outrun operational reality for at least a few hours. The new trainer was 26 years old, recently transferred from recruiting, and looked terrified standing near the locked training room holding a stack of onboarding folders she clearly had never opened before. 47 new hires sat waiting inside folding chairs arranged neatly beneath fluorescent lights, while warehouse supervisors paced the hallway checking watches and dispatch notifications on their phones. Peak shipping season leaves no room for delay once loading schedules begin backing up. I carried my cardboard box slowly through the parking lot, while cold rain drifted across the Nashville skyline in soft gray waves. Halfway to my car, my phone vibrated for the first time. Then again. Then 6 more times before I even reached the driver's side door. Warehouse supervisors. Dispatch coordinators. Team leads. Nobody from human resources yet. That told me everything. The first people feeling collapse were always the people actually moving the work. I sat inside my car listening to rain strike the windshield while voicemail notifications stacked across my screen one after another. Emily, onboarding credentials are not activating. The safety badges are pending review again. Dispatch queue turned yellow on dock 3. Do you know why warehouse access approval disappeared? Because someone disabled the wrong account. The company thought they were removing a trainer. In reality, they removed the operational bridge connecting 5 systems nobody fully understood anymore because I spent 13 years quietly translating process logic between departments that barely communicated correctly on their own. Around 10 o'clock, the first major bottleneck hit. I knew because one of the dispatch supervisors texted me a photograph from inside the loading dock area. 3 freight trucks sat idle beneath bright warehouse lights while workers stood beside pallet stacks waiting for digital release confirmations that never arrived. The dispatch software itself still worked perfectly. That was the problem. Systems do exactly what they are programmed to do, even when leadership forgets the human approval sequence controlling movement underneath the dashboard. Every outbound shipment required active warehouse safety verification tied to onboarding completion status. Those approvals flowed through a permissions chain connected to my disabled process authority. Human resources never transferred it before removing my access. Around 10:30, the junior trainer finally called me directly, sounding close to tears already. I could hear dozens of nervous voices echoing behind her from the training room. Emily, she whispered quickly. The new hires cannot access the onboarding portal. Did information technology transfer the learning management system authority? I asked calmly. Silence. Then softly, I do not think anyone knew there was authority to transfer. Of course they did not. Because executives think process lives inside manuals instead of inside the people quietly maintaining workflow connections every single day. The manuals are there, she continued desperately. But the onboarding sequence is not matching the warehouse clearance screens. Because the manuals only covered normal workflow. Not exception routing. Not timing conflicts. Not real operational pressure during peak season. Outside the training room, more supervisors started gathering near the dispatch screens as loading delays spread through the warehouse. Green cues slowly shifted yellow across the system dashboard one after another like warning lights moving through a storm. And somewhere upstairs inside human resources, somebody was probably still telling leadership this was only a temporary training delay, instead of the beginning of operational paralysis. By 11 o'clock, 3 departments were already waiting on approvals from a woman they called non-essential less than 2 hours earlier. By noon, the warehouse floor sounded different. Not louder exactly. More strained. Forklifts still moved between loading lanes beneath bright industrial lights, but now every sound carried hesitation underneath it. Drivers stood beside outbound trailers checking phones while dispatch coordinators refreshed approval screens that refused to clear shipment queues correctly. The company still looked operational from the outside. Trucks lined the docks. Employees hurried through aisles carrying scanners and paperwork. Managers paced with clipboards pretending movement still meant control. But underneath all of it, the process chain had started separating one broken connection at a time. I sat inside a quiet diner near the interstate drinking cold coffee, while messages continued flooding my phone faster than I could read them. Warehouse supervisors. Compliance staff. Payroll coordinators. Customer service leads. Nobody from human resources yet. That part mattered because collapse always reaches the operational people first. Executives only notice once consequences become visible enough to threaten reports and clients. Around 12:23, another photograph arrived from inside the warehouse. 6 outbound shipments now sat frozen in release status beneath giant digital dispatch boards glowing yellow across multiple lanes. Drivers leaned against loading barriers looking irritated while supervisors argued quietly near the operations desk. The dispatch system itself was functioning perfectly. The problem was sequence authorization. Every outbound release depended on completed safety onboarding verification tied to employee access credentials and warehouse compliance routing. When human resources disabled my permissions that morning, they unknowingly interrupted the approval chain linking onboarding status to active dispatch release validation. Nobody transferred the bridge before removing the person maintaining it. Around 12:40, the regional operations director finally called me directly for the first time in nearly 3 years. His voice sounded controlled, but I could hear pressure underneath every sentence. "Emily," he said carefully, "we are experiencing unexpected onboarding delays." Unexpected. Corporate language always softens disaster until denial becomes impossible. "How many trucks are waiting?" I asked calmly. Silence answered first. Then quietly, 9. I looked out the diner window toward the rain-covered interstate while freight traffic rolled slowly past beneath dark Tennessee clouds outside. 9 trucks delayed before lunch during peak season was not a small inconvenience. That was contract exposure, overtime escalation, retail timing disruption, thousands of dollars bleeding quietly through operational paralysis. Every hour the workflow remained broken. Did information technology restore the approval sequence permissions? I asked. "They are reviewing system access now," he replied quickly, which meant no. Information technology was probably staring at dashboards wondering why every system appeared technically operational, while the actual movement of work kept freezing between departments. That is the thing executives never understand about process coordination. Software handles transactions. People handle continuity. And continuity disappears fast once companies remove the person translating systems into real operational flow. Around 1:15, the first customer escalation hit according to another supervisor text message. A regional retail client wanted to know why shipment tracking statuses stopped updating despite trucks still sitting physically inside the warehouse. Customer service blamed dispatch. Dispatch blamed onboarding delays. Human resources blamed temporary system transition issues. Meanwhile, 47 new hires still sat trapped inside a fluorescent training room waiting for activation credentials. No one remaining in the building fully understood how to authorize correctly anymore. Then came the message that finally shifted the atmosphere from frustration into fear. "Emily," one supervisor texted quietly, the regional director, "just asked who actually built the process map." I stared at the screen for several seconds because deep down I already knew what they were discovering upstairs. The manuals explain tasks. I was the one who understood movement, and those are not the same thing at all. Around 1:42, another dispatch queue turned red. By 2 o'clock, the warehouse had stopped functioning like a coordinated operation and started behaving like 5 disconnected departments trapped inside the same building. That was always the danger executives never understood about process work. They thought systems failed dramatically with alarms and crashes. Real operational collapse feels quieter than that at first. Delays. Pauses. Approval queues waiting on invisible decisions nobody remembers how to route anymore. I knew the situation was getting serious when the customer service director finally called me personally. She had ignored half my process review meetings for years, because executives usually treat training departments like background noise until clients start threatening contracts. "Emily," she said immediately without greeting, "our national retail account is escalating shipment delays to corporate procurement." In the background behind her I could hear overlapping phone calls, ringing desk lines, and the sharp nervous sound of people typing too fast under pressure. Customer service floors always sound different once panic starts spreading. "How many delayed orders?" I asked calmly. 37 and climbing. I closed my eyes briefly while trucks rolled past outside the diner windows beneath gray Nashville skies. 37 delayed orders during peak season was not a workflow inconvenience anymore. That was revenue exposure, penalty risk, client trust damage. The dispatch queues are frozen because onboarding verification never cleared, I explained quietly. Warehouse release cannot complete without active compliance sequencing. Silence answered first. Then the customer service director lowered her voice. Human Resources said this was only a training transition issue. There it was again. That word. Training. As if operations existed separately from movement, timing, and approval continuity. Companies love minimizing the work they do not fully understand. Around 2:15, another supervisor sent me screenshots from inside the warehouse control room. Half the dispatch lanes now glowed red across the digital routing board, while supervisors argued near the shipping monitors. Forklift traffic slowed because outbound staging areas filled faster than trucks could leave. Drivers waited beside sealed trailers checking overtime clocks while loading crews stood with scanners in their hands waiting for releases. Nobody remaining in the building knew how to authorize correctly anymore. The systems still worked. The people connecting the systems no longer did. Then came the Teams meeting screenshot. Regional leadership. Human resources. Information technology. Compliance. Warehouse management. 15 people inside a conference room staring at process maps projected across a wall none of them fully understood. What caught my attention most was the folder open beside the screen. Process Flow Master. Emily Hartman. They finally found the operational maps I built over 13 years linking onboarding, warehouse access, dispatch release, payroll activation, safety certification, and exception routing together across departments. The problem was process maps explain structure. They do not teach judgment. A few minutes later, the junior trainer called again, sounding completely overwhelmed now. "Emily, I found the sequence charts," she whispered quickly. "But the arrows are not matching the dispatch exceptions. Because exceptions depend on timing logic. Seniority routing. Compliance hold codes. Safety override conditions. Human movement inside operational pressure. Things experienced process coordinators solve instinctively after years inside real workflow environments. The warehouse supervisors are yelling at human resources now," she continued quietly. "Everyone keeps asking who designed this system." I looked down at the untouched coffee beside me while rain streaked softly across the parking lot outside. Funny thing was, I never designed the operation alone. I just spent 13 years learning how to keep broken departments communicating long enough for the company to function despite itself. Around 2:47, another message arrived from the regional operations director. Only one sentence this time. "We underestimated how much of the operation depended on you." I stared at the screen for several seconds because deep down that was never actually true. They did not underestimate me. They underestimated the difference between documentation and understanding. And somewhere behind those glowing warehouse screens, another dispatch lane quietly turned red. By 3:30 in the afternoon, the warehouse parking lot looked like a traffic jam built entirely out of expensive mistakes. Freight trucks lined the loading lanes beneath dark Tennessee clouds while drivers stood outside smoking cigarettes beside sealed trailers that still could not leave the docks. Inside the building, every department had stopped pretending the situation was temporary. Human resources stopped using phrases like minor onboarding delays. Information technology stopped blaming software latency. Even the regional leadership team finally understood the systems themselves were not broken. The operational sequence connecting them had disappeared the moment they removed the person quietly coordinating movement between departments. I knew the atmosphere inside the building had changed completely when the payroll manager called me directly. In 13 years, she had never called my personal phone once. "Emily," she said immediately, skipping introductions entirely. "New hire payroll profiles are not activating because onboarding verification never completed." Another chain reaction. Another dependency nobody upstairs realized connected back through the training workflow approvals they disabled that morning. Without completed onboarding status, warehouse access remained pending. Without active warehouse access, compliance validation stalled. Without compliance validation, dispatch release queues froze. Without dispatch release, outbound shipments backed up across loading docks. Every department thought they were operating independently until the sequence stopped moving. "How many employees are waiting?" I asked, quietly. Papers shuffled on her end before she answered. 53 now. Not just the original 47 seasonal hires anymore. Existing workers transferring departments had started backing into inactive payroll status too, because the approval chain handled more than onboarding. Human systems always spread wider than executives think. Around 3:45, one of the warehouse supervisors sent me a short video from the dispatch floor. The camera moved slowly past glowing routing screens filled with red alerts while supervisors stood shoulder to shoulder around the central operations desk speaking over each other beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Forklifts sat idle near outbound staging areas because trailers were no longer clearing fast enough to create movement space. Pallets stacked higher along loading corridors while dispatch coordinators refreshed frozen release screens over and over again like repetition might somehow create authority the system no longer recognized. Then the camera turned briefly toward the conference room overlooking the warehouse floor. Human Resources was inside now too. I recognized the HR director immediately through the glass walls standing stiffly beside projected process diagrams, while the regional operations director pointed sharply toward workflow charts spread across the table. Nobody looked confident anymore. That part mattered. Corporate arrogance survives right until operational reality becomes visible enough to threaten money. At 4 o'clock sharp, my phone rang again. This time it was the vice president of regional operations. I had met him maybe 4 times in 13 years. Executives that high usually only notice process coordinators when audits happen or systems fail publicly enough to interrupt investor reporting. Emily, he said carefully, voice lower than I expected. We need to understand exactly what happened today. I almost answered honestly. Nothing happened today. The company simply discovered how much invisible coordination work had been protecting them from collapse every single day before now. Instead I asked, how many dispatch lanes are red? Silence. Then quietly, all of them. Outside the diner window, rainwater streamed across the interstate while afternoon traffic crawled through Nashville beneath heavy gray skies. Somewhere inside that warehouse, supervisors were probably still trying to explain to angry drivers why completed shipments could not legally leave the building. Somewhere upstairs, Human Resources was likely realizing process documentation meant nothing if nobody remaining understood how to interpret timing conflicts, exception routing, and approval continuity under pressure. Then another message arrived from the junior trainer. Only 6 words this time. Human Resources is panicking right now. I stared at the screen for a long moment because panic was not actually the dangerous part. The dangerous part was that the operation still had 3 more hours left in the business day. By 4:30, the operation was no longer slowing down. It was separating completely. Inside the warehouse, outbound staging lanes filled so fast that supervisors started rerouting forklifts through alternate corridors just to keep movement possible between loading zones. Drivers leaned against trailers checking overtime clocks while dispatch coordinators sat frozen in front of glowing red queue alerts. Nobody remaining inside the building knew how to clear legally. The company still had software. Still had managers. Still had executives holding emergency meetings behind glass conference room walls. What it no longer had was continuity. And continuity is the thing companies always mistake for automation until the human being maintaining it disappears. I finally left the diner shortly after 4:45 and drove slowly toward downtown Nashville, while rain drifted across the interstate in silver streaks beneath dark evening clouds. My phone sat face down on the passenger seat, vibrating every few minutes now. Regional operations. Compliance managers. Human Resources. The vice president called twice more. I ignored every call. Not because I wanted revenge. Honestly, by that point the operation was collapsing under its own assumptions faster than anything I could have done intentionally. Around 5 o'clock, another message arrived from the junior trainer. This time she attached a photograph from inside the emergency operations meeting. The conference room looked exhausted. Coffee cups scattered across the table. Process maps taped against the walls. Information technology staff staring at system architecture diagrams, while warehouse leadership argued beside dispatch projections filled entirely red. What caught my attention most was the Human Resources director sitting silently near the end of the table, no longer speaking at all. Earlier that morning she confidently explained training could be streamlined. 8 hours later she looked like someone finally realizing the company never understood the difference between reducing payroll and removing operational memory. Then the junior trainer sent another message. Information technology confirmed the systems are functioning correctly. Of course they were. That was the terrifying part. The software never failed. The building never lost power. No servers crashed. No cyber attack happened. The operation stopped moving because nobody left inside understood the sequencing logic connecting onboarding, compliance, dispatch, payroll activation, warehouse clearance, and exception routing together under live pressure. Around 5:20, the regional operations director finally left me a voicemail instead of another rushed phone call. His voice sounded completely different now. Slower. Less executive. More honest. "Emily," he said quietly, "we made a serious mistake today." In the background behind him I could hear warehouse alarms beeping softly, and overlapping voices echoing across the dispatch floor. "The loading docks are backed up across every lane. We have national accounts threatening escalation. Human resources cannot restore the process chain, because nobody fully understands the exception routing structure." He paused for a moment before continuing more carefully. "We need your help." I sat parked beside the Cumberland River overlooking the Nashville skyline glowing faintly beneath the rain while traffic moved slowly through evening rush hour around me. For 13 years, nobody upstairs ever asked how the operation kept recovering from near misses, timing conflicts, staffing gaps, audit pressure, and seasonal overload without collapse. They assumed smooth operations meant the systems were strong. They never considered maybe somebody was quietly holding fragile departments together every single day before problems became visible enough to threaten executives. Another message arrived while I listened to the voicemail again. This one from a warehouse supervisor I trusted. "Drivers are timing out now. Payroll approvals are frozen. Safety badges still inactive. Human resources is blaming process complexity." I almost laughed hearing that because complexity was never the real issue. Respect was. Companies always believe invisible work is simple right until the exact moment the invisible worker disappears. At 5:42 the vice president called one final time. I let the phone ring twice before answering. And for the first time all day, nobody on the other end tried calling my job training anymore. The vice president did not sound like an executive anymore once I answered the phone. He sounded like a man standing inside a building slowly realizing nobody there understood how to keep it functioning through the night. In the background behind his voice, I could hear forklifts reversing, dispatch alarms beeping softly, and overlapping conversations echoing across the warehouse floor beneath fluorescent lights. "Emily," he said carefully, "we need to stabilize operations before second shift begins. Not fix software. Not review policy. Stabilize movement." Finally somebody upstairs was using the correct language. I stayed quiet for a moment watching rain slide slowly down the windshield while Nashville traffic moved through the evening darkness beyond the riverfront. "How many outbound lanes are operational?" I asked. Papers shuffled somewhere on his end before he answered quietly. 2 out of 11. My eyes closed briefly hearing that because 11 lanes reduced to 2 during peak season was no longer an operational disruption. That was full-scale throughput collapse. Every delayed truck created more overtime exposure, more customer penalties, more scheduling conflict, more warehouse congestion feeding pressure back into the system hour by hour. "And onboarding?" I asked. "Still frozen." Of course it was. The company removed the approval bridge connecting training completion, safety certification, payroll activation, warehouse clearance, and dispatch validation all at once because human resources believed process coordination was administrative overhead instead of infrastructure. "What exactly do you need from me?" I asked calmly even though deep down I already knew the answer. Another long silence followed before the vice president finally said it directly. "Nobody here understands how the workflow sequence actually functions under exceptions." There it was. The truth stripped clean of executive language. Around 6:15, I drove back toward the distribution center through steady Tennessee rain, while warehouse floodlights glowed against low clouds ahead like an exhausted industrial city, still trying to pretend everything remained under control. The parking lot looked worse now. Trucks lined access roads waiting for loading assignments while employees gathered near side entrances checking phones and smoking beside rain-soaked concrete barriers. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody moved casually. Crisis changes workplace body language faster than meetings ever do. Inside the lobby, security guards recognized me immediately and opened the side access gate without speaking. My old employee badge still remained disabled, clipped uselessly inside my purse beside termination paperwork from that morning. Funny how quickly corporate paperwork loses confidence once operations stop moving. Upstairs, the emergency operations conference room looked like a battlefield built entirely from process diagrams, coffee cups, laptops, and exhausted people trying desperately to understand systems they spent years ignoring, because somebody else quietly carried the responsibility for them. The human resources director looked up when I entered the room, but this time she did not speak first. That mattered too. Around the table sat warehouse leadership, compliance officers, dispatch managers, payroll coordinators, information technology analysts, and regional executives, all staring toward the same process flow. Charts projected across the conference room wall. My charts. My routing structures. My exception maps. The systems are functioning, the information technology director admitted immediately once I sat down. But approvals are locking inside conflicting dependency loops. Translation. The software worked exactly as designed. The humans running it did not. I walked slowly toward the projected workflow map, while dozens of tired eyes followed me across the room. Within seconds I saw the problem. Human resources restored basic permissions incorrectly, creating circular approval conflicts between onboarding verification and dispatch release validation. Every correction they attempted throughout the afternoon only deepened the sequence deadlock, because nobody remaining understood which dependencies had priority under live operational pressure. You restored the permissions in the wrong order, I said calmly. The room went completely silent. Then the vice president asked the question nobody upstairs had thought important enough to ask until now. How long would it take you to fix this? I looked around the conference room at exhausted executives, overloaded managers, glowing dispatch screens, and process maps they finally realized were not paperwork at all. They were the nervous system of the entire company. Then I answered honestly. About 45 minutes if nobody interrupts me. The room stayed silent after I said 45 minutes. Not skeptical silence. Exhausted silence. The kind that settles over people once they finally understand the difference between authority and competence. Outside the conference room windows, the warehouse floor still moved in fragments beneath bright industrial lighting, while dispatch alarms flashed red across multiple lanes. Supervisors hurried between staging areas carrying radios and clipboards while drivers waited beside trailers already running late enough to trigger contractual penalties. Peak season logistics never pauses politely, while executives reorganize departments. Every delayed hour spreads pressure outward like floodwater through every connected system underneath it. I set my cardboard box quietly beside the conference room wall and walked toward the operations console where 3 information technology analysts sat staring at workflow dashboards filled with frozen approvals and conflicting validation loops. The screens themselves looked normal. Clean software interfaces, organized status indicators, perfectly functioning systems. That was always the problem with operational collapse. Technology rarely shows panic the same way humans do. Nobody touches the permissions until I finish tracing the sequence, I said calmly. For the first time all day, nobody argued with me. I logged into the administrative workflow console, using temporary consultant credentials the vice president approved 15 minutes earlier. Funny how quickly companies create emergency authority once consequences become measurable in money instead of ego. Within seconds, I saw the damage human resources accidentally caused while trying to restore system access throughout the afternoon. They reactivated onboarding approvals before restoring dispatch hierarchy synchronization, which forced compliance verification into circular dependency conflicts across warehouse release channels. Every attempted correction afterward only locked additional workflows behind inactive safety validation triggers. You restored the employee permissions alphabetically instead of operationally, I explained quietly while opening the sequence tree across the main dashboard. One information technology analyst frowned slightly. We assumed access priority followed department structure. The operation does not move by department, I replied. It moves by timing. Around the room, exhausted managers watched silently while I rerouted onboarding completion validation through temporary exception pathways tied directly into dispatch release sequencing. Then I rebuilt warehouse clearance priority chains manually one approval node at a time. Payroll activation moved last because payroll depends on onboarding confirmation, but not outbound dispatch continuity. Human resources had restored everything simultaneously without understanding dependency direction. Software follows logic exactly. The people configuring it still need to understand reality. Outside the conference room, I could already hear movement changing across the warehouse floor as the first dispatch lanes unlocked successfully beneath the new sequence routing. Radios crackled louder. Forklifts started moving faster between staging zones. One supervisor nearly jogged across the loading area carrying updated release sheets toward outbound docks. Lane 3 just cleared, somebody shouted from outside the room. 30 seconds later, another voice echoed across the operations floor. Lane 5 is moving again. Nobody inside the conference room spoke for several moments after that because deep down every executive there understood something uncomfortable now. The operation never depended primarily on software. It depended on someone understanding how humans, timing, compliance, payroll, onboarding, warehouse movement, and dispatch sequencing connected together under pressure. Around 7 o'clock, the final frozen onboarding queue cleared successfully across the warehouse system. 47 new hires finally received active credentials after sitting inside that fluorescent training room nearly the entire business day waiting for approvals. Nobody remaining inside the building understood how to authorize correctly without me. The vice president looked down at the dispatch dashboard where glowing red lanes slowly shifted back toward green one by one across the screen. "That is it?" he asked quietly. I leaned back in the operations chair staring at the stabilized workflow map, while rain tapped softly against the warehouse windows outside. "That is all it ever was," I replied calmly. "A sequence." Nobody answered after that because for the first time all day, the room finally understood something simple. I had never trained employees. I had been holding the operation together. By 8:30 that night, the warehouse finally sounded normal again. Forklifts moved steadily between outbound lanes beneath bright industrial lights while dispatch coordinators updated release boards no longer glowing red across the operations floor. Drivers pulled trailers away from loading docks one by one beneath the rain-soaked Tennessee night while supervisors leaned against railings looking less like people surviving disaster and more like workers slowly recovering from panic. The systems had not changed. The software remained exactly the same as it was that morning. The only thing restored was sequence, continuity, understanding. Funny how companies spend millions on technology, while overlooking the person quietly translating movement between departments every single day. I stood alone for a moment near the warehouse observation windows watching outbound trailers disappear toward the interstate beneath rows of glowing floodlights. 13 years inside that building. 13 years catching workflow failures before executives noticed them. 13 years solving timing conflicts, staffing gaps, onboarding delays, audit risks, payroll routing problems, and dispatch bottlenecks quietly enough that leadership assumed smooth operations happen naturally. Most invisible work gets punished instead of respected because when people never see disaster, they assume the disaster was never possible in the first place. Behind me, the conference room door opened softly. The vice president stepped out carrying 2 paper coffee cups while exhausted managers continued talking quietly inside around process maps, still taped across the walls. He handed me one without speaking immediately. "Human Resources wants to reverse the termination," he said finally after a long silence. I looked down at the coffee warming my hands while rain tapped softly against the warehouse windows outside. Reverse the termination. Corporate language always tries making emotional damage sound administrative. "And?" I asked calmly. He exhaled slowly before answering. "They want you back permanently. Senior Operations Authority. Salary increase. Full department oversight." Earlier that morning, they called me non-essential operational overhead. 8 hours later, they were offering executive authority because 11 dispatch lanes turned red after removing the woman quietly holding the workflow together. I almost smiled thinking about it. "No," I said gently. The vice president looked surprised for only a second before understanding settled across his face. Not offended, just realistic. "You already decided?" he asked. I nodded once toward the warehouse floor below us where loading crews moved confidently again beneath restored dispatch sequencing. A company that only understands your value after collapse will eventually forget it again, once things feel stable. He stared quietly through the observation glass for several moments after that because deep down he knew I was right. Stability makes executives forget the people protecting them from instability. That cycle never changes. Around 9:15, I walked back into the training room for the first time since my badge failed that morning. Most of the new hires had already gone home exhausted after spending nearly an entire business day trapped inside onboarding limbo. They never understood. Only the junior trainer remained sitting beside stacks of untouched orientation folders beneath fluorescent lights. She looked up nervously when I entered. "I am sorry," she whispered quickly. "I did not know any of this depended on you." I sat beside her quietly for a moment, listening to warehouse movement echo softly through the building outside. Then I smiled gently because none of this was really her fault. "It was never supposed to depend on one person," I replied. "That is the part leadership should have fixed years ago." Before leaving, I spent another hour reorganizing the operational documentation properly. Not just manuals, real continuity maps.
Exception routing explanation.
Timing sequences. Dependency structures. The kind of knowledge companies usually leave trapped inside experienced employees until crisis forces reality into the open. Around 10:30, I carried my cardboard box through the warehouse one final time while employees waved quietly from dispatch desks and loading lanes beneath bright industrial lights. Nobody called me the training manager anymore. Nobody called the work simple. Outside, the rain had finally stopped over Nashville. Trucks rolled steadily toward the interstate while warehouse floodlights reflected across wet pavement behind me. Somewhere inside that building, executives were probably still trying to explain how an entire operation nearly collapsed in 5 hours because they removed one woman from a training room. But deep down, the truth was much simpler than that. They thought I taught people how to do the job. They never understood I was the reason the work kept moving at all.